Welcome to The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. He was arguably the most charismatic and enigmatic frontman in the history of rock. James Douglas Morrison, the lead singer of the 60s psychedelic band The Doors, was found dead in a bathtub in Paris in July 1971. But his supposed death at the age of 27 only intensified his legend and mystique. On this episode of The Conspiracy Show, we investigate claims that Jim Morrison did not die in Paris in 1971. In fact, we're about to meet several rock investigators who believe there are too many inconsistencies and mysteries in the official version of events. Not everyone is convinced Morrison's tomb in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris is empty. We'll hear from a skeptic who will affirm, as Morrison himself wrote, "Nobody here gets out alive." Me? I just want the truth, and I'm willing to follow it wherever it leads. It is time to redefine reality. Genetic enigma or a human alien hybrid?
That's how cynical I am now about the process. Mainstream media,
technology, alter weather patterns
created by the corporation.
has been engineered by the Illuminati.
There's no doubt.
In 1966, I met Ann Morrison. I married her, and it turns out she was the sister of Jim Morrison, the famous Doors. However, at that time, we didn't know it because he disappeared after graduating from UCLA. About 6 months after our marriage, we got a package in the mail from the United States. We opened it up, and there was an album cover, and it had a picture of Jim Morrison on it. And I had no idea. I came home from work, and my wife was sitting on the floor crying with all our friends around. There was this weird Bach organ music, death, funeral music playing. It was intense, but they were all crying. I went, "Oh my God, someone's dead here." She said, "Do you know who this is?" And I said, "No." And she said, "This is my brother." And I went, and it was intense because we started listening to the quality of the music, and it was not lightweight. It was beautiful. Blues and rock and roll and rhythm and blues, but classical too, poetry and Bach and Shakespeare and everyone in this beautiful, beautiful first album, The Doors. He graduated from UCLA with a degree in cinema and fine arts, and wrote to his father and said, "Dad, I found this band and I want to become a musician." And his dad flipped and said, "Okay, that's it, cut off, no matter what. And by the way, draft board, go sign up because you're now no longer a student. And until you do exactly what we need, you're cut off." So they cut him off, and he didn't run away.
You know, he told his record label that his parents were dead, and then his mother and sister show up for one of his shows. I know that his father and Jim had issues because his father was the youngest admiral, and he never got another promotion because the Doors were so big in the counterculture, and that his father had actually tried to have agents go find Jim because Jim refused to go into the draft and refused to serve his country. So that was a barrier between them. A lot of people think that, who are close, thought that maybe his father was relieved when Jim died.
That's what the Admiral wanted. And so that's what Jim was running from, that resentment. He never spoke to them ever again. If you brought up your daddy, come up, or he would just freeze you out. No one could talk to him about his parents. For him, the Admiral's like, you're wasting all this on Hollywood crap, and you could be anything. Yeah, he could have been. In fact, when he graduated from UCLA, IBM, CIA, FBI, and all the headhunters approached him and I think 8 others because he was classified what they call gifted student status. And big companies want those kids, you know, all of them. So he could have been anything. So, which leads me to what he could have been and what he might have been and what he still may be for all we know.
He talks about a German citizen that resembled Jim so completely. He said, "I saw a photograph, I couldn't tell them apart."
So he died in his hotel room in the bathtub, apparent heart attack there, and his wife discovered him, common wife Pamela Corson, brought in a doctor, and supposedly those are the only two people who saw him after he died. The doctor signed the death certificate that was a heart attack. There was no autopsy performed afterwards, which once again was kind of odd. An American in France, that young of an age, it was customary, I've been told, that he should have had an autopsy.
There was no autopsy? Can you imagine somebody so famous? There was no investigation? Why not? Because she didn't follow up. She didn't go to the authorities, the American authorities, and say, this is Jim Morrison, his father is Admiral Morrison, and he died.
Pamela Corson, who did see the body, tried to convince the medical examiner that Morrison had died from congestive heart failure brought on by this terrible cough.
She did the reverse opposite, the polar opposite of that behavior. Everything to cover up his death. Why?
She was able to sell the story. Now, she didn't tell the family.
And then they had the funeral. None of the family, immediate family, was invited. None of the Doors band member. There was 5 people there at that funeral. It's kind of murky who those 5 people were.
I know that Ray Manzarek had sent the Doors manager, Bill Siddons, to Paris to check on the body, and when he left, Ray looked at him and said, make sure. He said, I don't want to sound ghoulish, but make sure. So when Bill got to Paris, he saw a simple wood veneer coffin with a coffin lid screwed into place. He didn't see the body.
There's no question, I think, that he's dead. The question is sort of more how and where and when did he die?
Richard, you mentioned after Morrison died, there was no autopsy. Now, I'm not even sure that's legal given the circumstances surrounding his death. But on the death certificate, it mentioned, or it listed the cause of death as heart failure. That's a little like saying Ernest Hemingway died of a trauma to the brain. Very vague.
The conspiracy here is very possibly just one of protecting rich drug dealers, more so than anything else. And I think that probably the doctor came in and said, okay, what's the thing that we don't really have to examine much more? You know what? Heart failure. Everyone will believe that.
Just so much wrong information about his death that now, and with Oliver Stone's, cartoon version of what Jim's life was, there's no reality in who he really was and what happened to him.
Everyone knows that he drank, that he smoked, that he did recreational drugs. People would buy heart failure. And, if we bury him fast enough, that'll be, we'll get away with this.
After doing heroin all night with his girlfriend, total lie. He got into the bathtub. And her story unravels to me badly because the truth was she was hanging with the local heroin addicts, Agnes Varda, Marianne Faithful, and the Count, who was a heroin supplier. All of that whole culture was Marseille heroin, real heroin, not the American 50%. This was almost pure. So Pamela was very much into that. And a drunk is a drunk. That's his poison, this evil pall of junkies, sweating, white, sickness. That wasn't Jim.
You looked at the death scene photos. Did it look like Jim in the bathtub?
Couldn't tell. Big beard, big hair, eyes closed. Could have been.
If you talk to Alan Graham's got an interesting story. Of course, Alan was Jim's brother-in-law, and he talks about a German citizen that resembled Jim so completely. He said, I saw a photograph, I couldn't tell them apart.
Could that have been the guy Pamela found when she came home and just freaked and didn't look close enough? When she was also on junk and going there?
What if Dietmar, the German immigrant or the German individual, passed away and his body was buried? It would allow Jim the ultimate opportunity to escape.
This guy would show up in the bar and they'd say, hi, Jim. And it wasn't Jim, it was Dieter. If you knew what we looked like back then, a lot of people had big beards and big hair. They looked like Charlie Manson. And Jim Morrison did look like Rasputin. I'm saying, who saw him? And what state were they in when they saw him?
went and he visited the cemetery in France where he was buried a few times. There was a lot of French poets and people he admired, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, and he picked out his gravesite, and that was like 3 days before he ended up dying.
Many people have commented upon visiting the plot, including his former bandmates, I believe it was either John Densmore or Bobby Krieger, who looked at the size of the plot. Now, Jim was about 5'11", and said there's no way they could fit his body in this plot.
You know, I don't have an answer for that. I do know that when people are buried, you know, particularly if, you know, you get the little pine box, if you're not someone of means and you're buried by the state, sometimes, you know, your legs are bent a little bit when you're put in the box. Sometimes, now that's certainly not the case here, but I do know that it's, you know, a few inches discrepancy here and there. You know, I don't know what that's all about.
I'm 6'2", and to be 6 foot tall, you could not be in that space. I think Densmore makes that statement in Riders on the Storm when he goes to Père Lachaise about the grave being short. I know Ray Manzarek stood on the grave and said, this grave's too short. Jim can't be buried here.
Morrison's father was the admiral of the battleship involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a false flag incident that launched the Vietnam War.
"10 years after his death, I was doing a rock opera at Gazzari's called Morrison the Rock Opera. And we had 7 Jim Morrisons. We called them the Jimtations. And they were all performing and fighting each other. And it was a kind of interesting little play. And we were all standing out front one day, and this guy walked by. I swear to God. Quickly he looked back like that, and one of the clones said, "Hey, Jim!" He just thought it was too. And the guy looked back, and for a minute there, you know, it's like, a little older, and the guy scurried away. But it was like, did he come by to see what we were doing there? We were doing the revival, and we were trying to delve into his death at that time, what happened to him. And so I've often, people have said, yeah, could it have been Jim? You know, maybe.
Morrison had a very high IQ, and he had told the members of the band that he could see himself retiring from the music business. He wanted to be a poet, or he could go into business, and then he sort of disappeared.
He sat down with Jack Holtzman, who was an record exec at Elektra, and he said, "Jack, what would happen to record sales if I were to suddenly disappear? How would it affect business? Would people believe it?" It sounds like he really gave it careful consideration.
He may have, you know, he may have. People who are high often have kind of odd ideas about things. And, you know, maybe, you know, let's keep in mind the time. Let's keep in time, you know, the place, Los Angeles, late 60s. Let's think about what state of mind he might have been in when all this was happening. He's being worked very hard, harder than he's ever worked before in his life. He's surrounded by people, all of whom want something from him. I think probably the natural inclination that he might have is, I want out of this, I want some kind of break from it. So maybe, you know, he may well have thought about it. He may have thought about it, though, in terms of, you know, what would happen if I took a year off? I wouldn't mind taking some time off. But when you're famous, it's not like having a 9-to-5 job. You don't get to take a week off from being famous. You're still going to be famous no matter sort of what happens. And so I think with Jim Morrison, he may well have fantasized about disappearing, but I have a feeling that maybe in his floral way of speaking, you know, taking a week off became, you know, what if I go away and I pretend I'm dead, man?
Morrison was part of the Laurel Canyon scene, and there's different researchers been looking into that. All the rock stars that came out of Laurel Canyon at the same time, they seem to have these curious backgrounds where their families were involved in military or intelligence work, such as Jim Morrison and his father. It's interesting to note that Morrison's father was the admiral of the battleship involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, basically a false flag incident that launched the Vietnam War.
1973, the LA Free Press, a couple of wire services, picked up on a story that someone claiming to be Jim Morrison, looking an awful lot like Jim Morrison, shows up at the Bank of America in San Francisco and conducts business. We even have the name of a bank employee there, Walt Fleischer, who says, I can't confirm 100% it was Jim, but he looked like him. What do you make of that?
Well, what did Jim Morrison look like at that time? I mean, in the few short years that he was famous, he went from this svelte kind of love god kind of looking Adonis almost with his unborn pony skin pants to being a bloated, heavier guy with long hair. So I'd be interested to know what this bank employee thought Jim Morrison would look like in 1973.
Thomas Lytle, he was a conspiracy researcher, and he looked into these rumors of Jim Morrison being alive, particularly between the period of 1972 and 1992. Somebody calling themselves James Douglas Morrison was involved in international banking, international espionage.
The idea that maybe he's out there somewhere and maybe there will be one more great Doors album. And that's, I think, what happened with Elvis. That's what happened with all these sightings that people claim, is that they're just not ready to let go yet.
Thomas Lytle himself died a few years ago, so who can say for sure?
Ray now says, when they open that grave on July 8, 2001, I'm going to be there with Doors fans around the world, and we're going to be saying, open the box, open the box.
Jim Morrison's house here in LA burned down recently. You familiar with that? The house on Love Street. Yeah, there was a serial arsonist working. I started thinking of the song Light My Fire, and perhaps maybe Jim Morrison came back to destroy some evidence. I mentioned that to a friend, and they said, well, I don't see it. After all the years of drinking and carry on, he'd be old and decrepit, but now the stories are that he got clean and sober after his supposed death and became this superstar intelligence agent. Maybe indeed he did come back and do that to cover his tracks.
Pamela did not have the money to buy the grave space, so she leased it for 30 years, which was in 2001. Everyone was convinced that Jim was going to be dug up and sent back to LA, and it would be the Jim Morrison's LA tour, but he was kept in Père Lachaise because the Morrison family agreed to clear the graffiti and to pay for security.
The three remaining members of the Doors, God love them, have made a living off keeping the legacy of Jim Morrison alive for a very long time. You know, let's build the legend of this guy who's no longer with us, because it will continue to sell records, it will continue to keep the mythology going, and people seem to like the mythology. We keep selling records, so let's do that.
Ray now says, oh no, he's dead, and you know, he's buried there, but in VH1, he also said, when they open that grave on July 8, 2001, I'm going to be there with Doors fans around the world, and we're going to be saying, open the box, open the box.
Jim Morrison, I think, it sounds to me like probably a sensitive guy who liked to write poetry, who was a guy who had a troubled family life, who, when he became famous, you know, self-medicated with drugs and alcohol.
I hope Jim's still alive somewhere. I really do. And it could be. In my romantic heart, I see him as saying, it, and walking away and becoming a different person.
The idea of disappearing was kind of probably a romantic notion for him. I think that's probably what he had in mind when he went to Paris.
And if anyone could have pulled it off, it would be him. Because in a way, he was mercurial and special.
I don't think there's any chance of him actually faking his own death and wanting it, because I think that deep down, Jim Morrison enjoyed being Jim Morrison. He enjoyed the fame and the advantages and the women and everything else that came along with being that famous.
Perhaps the best evidence that Jim didn't die in 1971 is the near total absence of evidence that he did die. Only his wife, Pamela Corson, and the medical examiner that declared him dead were allowed to see the body. But Pam couldn't recall the name of the doctor. There's no police reports, emergency call logs, medical examiner logs, reports or records, and no autopsy was ever performed. And no real funeral to speak of. Jim Morrison was in love with the story of Arthur Rimbaud, a French poet who, at the age of 19, became overwhelmed by his fame, staged his death, and escaped to Africa. Jim told bandmate Robbie Krieger that 20 years after his death to expect a phone call from Mr. Mojo Risen. If Robbie did get a call from Jim back in 1991, I'm sure he would have kept it quiet. Wouldn't you do that for a friend? Now, I'd like to know what you think. You can get in touch with me here at The Conspiracy Show through the website, theconspiracyshow.com.